So there you have it, the one and only Jon Stewart. Clearly we had some disagreements with him, and there were actually more disagreements that we had with him that there just wasn't like time and space.
Yeah, we didn't have enough time. He was on a very tight schedule, so he had to,
one of the things, I would love to spend 30 minutes with him just on the Ukraine war coverage.
Right.
Because I kind of didn't want to go all in on like debating whether they've done a good job or not. And so we focus more on just like, well, why do they cover this one so much and not these other things, which I think is an important piece. But, I'd love to talk to him about what he thinks of the clip we played here today of the media only pressing the Biden administration in the direction of war, in the direction of escalation. The way that, the American people have been very poorly informed about what a no-fly zone would ultimately mean, which is reflected in polling that shows that if you just say, hey, no-fly zone, people are like, yes, let's do it. And when you're like, if it means World War III, they're like, no, let's definitely not do that. So those were some areas I would love to also get into with him.
I think, the one problem I had with what he was saying is he's still not willing to really stick it to the mainstream, if that makes sense. I almost feel like his, because I was talking about the party apparatus, and he was, wasn't quite willing to compare like the total integration of the Democratic Party or elite liberalism, particularly with MSNBC, in the way that he is with Fox. Like he seemed, I think, and I say this with respect, but that is a 2000s view of the world. Like I think that is a view of the world through which the Iraq War happened, and of which his most formative years. So I get it. I get where he's coming from. But I just think things have changed dramatically in that fusion.
Because I thought about this for a long time after the interview, because he was basically like, it's qualitatively different. Fox News is an organ of the Republican Party in a way that MSNBC and CNN aren't of the Democratic Party. Now, first of all, as we pointed out, like you clearly have a lot of very similar interconnectedness. This is something we've covered on our show. There's the Cuomos, and we're learning more and more about how directly they were involved with him and in directly pushing back against Simone Sanders. You've got Jen Psaki. So you have those overlaps. But I did think about it. I think there is a little bit of a distinction there in terms of Fox News really was built to be a sort of like Republican Party booster. And it is very direct, like they have direct partisan aims. CNN and MSNBC, first they were just billed as like money-making ventures.
CNN, MSNBC, to be fair, had a cool vision in the beginning.
MSNBC fell into this liberal framework because that was what sold, Exactly. Keith Olbermann was successful. Other things, everything else that they were doing was basically failing. So like, oh, this is our thing. But I don't think it's fair to say they don't have like ideological aims. Their original goals aren't directly like, we're here to support the Democratic Party, even though that ends up being effectively what they do. But they have very much an ideological mission, which is this particular liberal view of the world that they think is just the world. They don't really see the ideology of it, even though if you're us standing on the outside, like it's very clearly an ideological agenda.
And I was trying to point that out to him. I don't think it was becoming clear. Like I said, I think some of this is just colored by living, and I get it, like having scarred and all of that. But the world changed a lot in the last, even 5-6 years or whatever, since the Daily Show has gone off. And I found that to be probably the biggest point of contention and disagreement that I think that we had with him around like how the operating systems of those networks exactly work. There was just, I feel like, more graciousness towards them than they frankly deserve.
Well, and here's the thing is like, his solution was basically like, well, they could just do better. Just like putting it on the individuals, basically like, no, they could just do better. Like the ratings incentives don't have to push them in this direction. It's really just about them making better choices. And I fundamentally disagree with.
I agree.
I mean, there's no way of course the individuals in that system have agency, which is why we're tough on some of the individuals in the system. They choose to be there. They choose to cover it the way they do. They choose to cherry pick. They choose to propagandize. They choose to lie at times. Like all of those things are true. But it's also true that if you don't do those things, you're going to get chewed up and spit out by the system that exists right now. The incentives in cable news and the structure of cable news is what it is. There's no rescuing it by having like, well, if we just got better people in and they made better choices. No, because the whole reason that this group of people is there and being propped up and elevated is because they play well with the system as it exists. So as long as this is the landscape driven by corporate ad money, ratings-driven, infotainment, broken into these little atomized chunks where you can never have any sort of nuanced and thoughtful discussion, dependent on access for your career prospects.
Access is the key.
Yeah,
the number one thing.
And also the clubbiness that exists now between journalists and the people that they're covering, the fact that these are their friends and this is their social circle. Like, until you change that, you could change all of the people that are in the current system and you would just come out with an almost identical product. Yeah. They're all interchangeable.
Oh, 100%. And I think that actually that's the one area that I did agree a lot with him, where he was like, you have to accept that you can't have colleagues. This was hard to accept in the beginning.
Yeah.
Right? We were like, man, we're pissing a lot of people off. Feels like you pissed this guy off. You know, my phone rings and you pissed this person off. But the more the audience showed up, I was like, it's worth it. You know, it's worth to burn these bridges that you spend years creating in order to show people how it all works. And it doesn't make a lot of people in this town happy. It can make you a pariah. I mean, it can make you ignored, which is what we've effectively become. Even as the show gets bigger, it's inverse to its success in the circles of power, if that makes sense. And he understood that. He told his writers, he's like, you can't have friends. You will not have colleagues. It's just us. It's us against all of them. That's very much a mentality that I found and accept from him. Another area that I was trying to probe him on was, how do you get these interviews? You know, because the biggest problem that we have is that, some people want to come on, but they want to talk about this and want to talk about their BS bill, or like, the senator only has 5 minutes. Screw you, I don't care. You know, I'm not CNN here. I don't need you necessarily. You need my access to the audience. So then it becomes a matter of, how do you establish so much credibility as he does that people feel like they have to sit down?
Right.
Well, and that's kind of where we're at right now.
I also wonder because, for example, and you brought this up in the interview, he interviews VA Secretary Dennis McDonough.
Right.
Very uncomfortable interview.
Oh, man.
I mean, Jon...
the guy was like, I don't care what you think.
Jon is very, nice in these interviews, but he's also does not let people off the hook. And you saw that with Dennis McDonough, you saw it with Janet Yellen, you saw it with Jamie Dimon. I mean, he really comes in very prepared. This is, again, the advantage of doing a show that's periodic, that you don't have to perform on a daily basis, so he can spend the time to really research and dig in on these topics and prepare well for these high-level interviews. And I also think, with the show still being relatively new, Dennis McDonough had no idea that this is what he was getting into.
I think you're right.
When Jon Stewart asked for an interview. This guy's a comedian. He sees him as being he's on our team.
Right. He used to crap all over Fox.
Yeah, this is one of our people, right? I wonder if he's going to continue to have that kind of access as the more of these interviews are done and these high-level officials realize that this is not going to be a cakewalk. You are going to be held to account and you are going to have your feet held to the fire, because I think he has really delivered. That's been one of the most impactful parts of this show, is these interviews that he's done, and he's really good at it. And you can tell that what he told us about you can't have friends and you can't go in caring about whether this person will ever speak to you again, you can see in the interviews that he really actually follows that policy, because he doesn't, again, it's not ugly. It's not yelling at people just for the sake of yelling at them. But they're very tough, and they're very well-informed, and they're very uncomfortable for the interview subjects.
And he still has choke points. I mean, the guy works for Apple, technically, right? They distribute his show. I mean, it's funny, because I saw him interviewing Bob Iger, and I was like, I know that Bob Iger has a deep relationship with Apple. There was a deep one going back all the way to the Steve Jobs era. You know, they almost would have combined their companies in terms of Disney and Apple. So when I see this stuff, I'm like, if he pushes him a little bit too hard, these guys still all have friends, all around town. I just am thankful for the way that we set up our business so that doesn't even exist, because at the level that he's operating at, I mean, they will use everything to try and destroy you. So
that was another question I had written out for him that I didn't get to ask, was the decision to go with Apple versus going independent, because clearly here's a guy who has a following, who has enough money
to do what we're doing, and he'd be super
very easily, and then you don't have any corporate pressure above you, because so far, the thing that he's gotten the most pushback on his show were the comments he made about Rogan.
Oh, that's right. Defending Rogan.
And that was extremely controversial. And then he had to do another episode talking like with misinformation experts that was like, frankly, a little bit cringe.
Yeah.
But, you know, that made me think about how he has a similar vulnerability with Apple as Rogan now has with Spotify. And so even some of his stuff that he's said now on Russiagate, I mean, he's critical of Russiagate. He's critical of the dismissal of the lab leak theory. Well, it's kind of okay to say those things now. But I wonder if he would have been able to say them at the time when public opinion was so far on the side of, if you're even talking about lab leak, not only are you wrong, you're racist. I can imagine, you know, a similar, like, very aggressive cancellation campaign against him with regard to Apple and really bringing some pressure on him. So in any case, it was a really interesting conversation. It was really exciting to get to talk to Jon. I think his new show is really, really worthwhile. I recommend it to you guys, and we're grateful for him taking the time.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for watching. We really appreciate it. As we said, look, one of the things we talked about with Jon was about how to build a future media company. I think we've really settled on it. It's a tough time right now in order to do business on the web. I'm already shaking. I'm like, are they going to take us down today for playing a clip of Putin in English, even though it's it's the news and we have to show people. The only way that we can be 100% censorship proof is because of your guys' support. We think about you all the time. We sent that Jon Stewart interview out to our premium subscribers early. You guys are always top of mind because you give us the confidence to weather any storm, whatever may come. So thank you.
Yes, indeed. And I think we've never felt that more than we feel it right now. You know, it's very difficult to sort through all this information. It's very difficult to feel like you can present it without worrying about what the consequences are. I mean, they're reaching back to Ed Schultz into the grave to label him and cancel him. So there is a true climate of hysteria right now. So thank you guys for supporting us and making sure that we don't have to ever worry about that. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you back here next week.